Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for Thursday, the 29th of September, 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Hey, Mark, it's Peter Ryan coming to you from Montreal. I can't believe we're at the end of September. This year has flown by and we're at the end of the third quarter. I just don't know where time is going.
Yeah, I know it does seem crazy. You know, my daughter was 6 months old yesterday and it just feels like yesterday that she was born. And, you know, that's half a year gone already. And it just seems, I guess it's just as we're all getting older, everything accelerates.
Well, rub it in. I turned 50 earlier this month. I don't feel a day over 49, if I'm honest with you. But, you know, at the end of the day, you're right. You know, the time does fly. And we're in a really interesting CX Files podcast this week because we're speaking to somebody who is discussing a phenomenon, a CX phenomenon that's really traveling at the speed of light.
Yeah, well, Steve Loynd is an old friend of the podcast, a friend of both of ours. He's based just outside Washington, D.C. in Virginia. And Steve founded TrendzOwl a few years ago. And prior to that, he was like the head of, I think, CX and globalization practice, wasn't it, for Frost Sullivan for a long, long time. Correct. So he's a well-known, very senior analyst who's known globally as a really deep thinker. And if you read any of his material, then you know, clearly you can see that what he does often is take classical illusions and apply it to the modern world. You know, so you know, this is a guy who thinks about technology, but also talks about, you know, Shakespeare or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You know, so it's someone who's deeply read and is a very deep thinker. And he's talking with us this week about Metaverse. Now, this comes off the back of CX Outsourcers. So maybe you, as you were there, Peter, and you were the host and organizer, maybe you want to just sort of give a brief description of what Steve talked about in Las Vegas.
Well, CX Outsourcers, we had asked Steve if he would be able to come and discuss some of the key trends around channel evolution. Now, as you know, Mark, the channels in which consumers are looking to interact with businesses have evolved a lot over the course of the past several years. Going back to when I got into this game, it was pretty well the telephone or bust. Today, it's very different, where we can see consumers interacting across not one, not two, but multiple different channels in order to get something resolved. What Steve was doing was taking a more futuristic view of the channel landscape and talking a little bit about the impact of the metaverse and how Meta is going to be impacting the manner in which we as customers of goods and services are going to be looking to interact with different companies across the vertical spectrum. I will tell you that from probably the first 10 seconds of him getting up and presenting and talking about the subject matter he was going to discuss, he had the audience wrapped. It's a very telling sign when the audience is not looking at their phones or looking at the internet on their laptops, but rather they're taking notes and they're using their telephones to take photos of the slides that are up there. So I think that what you're going to be hearing about in the discussion with Steve today and what the audience is going to be hearing about is definitely a step to the next level in terms of what is going to be on the plates of us as consumers and also as CX professionals moving into 2023.
Yeah, and I think that what's particularly interesting that came out of the discussion for me was how Steve essentially said, don't believe the conventional wisdom. I think that we are being constantly bombarded with images of Mark Zuckerberg and executives from Meta and other big technology companies all telling us that we are about to spend hours a day inside Metaverse and this is the future and you need to work out, you know, where you're going to fit into this future. And I think it was very interesting that Steve said, you know, this is important. You know, this is going to happen, but it's not necessarily going to happen in exactly the way the tech guys in California are telling you, because there will be the influence of the people. I mean, you go back and look at any of the social networks, look at how Twitter started out and look at it today. It's entirely different and it's been shaped and guided by the public. And so I think that's something that the normal conventional wisdom is not taken into account here. So it's a really deep dive and insight from Steve in this discussion.
Well, there's nobody better to do it than Steve Loynd, in my opinion. As you said, Mark, he's probably one of the most well-rounded, most well-read individuals. Literally, not a news article goes by his screen that he doesn't not only devour, but I think come out with some of the most salient and prescient analysis around. And he's able to draw pretty well any macro level trend, any technology trend to the CX space. So I'm really excited to listen to this interview that you conducted with him earlier this week.
Okay, so let's go straight to the interview with Steve Loynd on the Metaverse. All right, Steve. Now, I know that you have developed a bit of a reputation as a speaker on the Metaverse. And I think this is because out of all the CX analysts I know, you're generally thought of as, very deep thinking. Maybe it's the love of Joyce and literature, but definitely you look further out than many other analysts. So, I mean, as we just kick off this conversation about the Metaverse, maybe you could just give us a definition. When you're talking to executives and, they just think of it as this kind of tech thing or gaming thing, how do you define why is it important to them? And what is it?
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Mark. And this stuff is quite fun to think about and talk about, as you and I do quite often. So it's those types of topics that are sometimes a little more interesting to wander into. But, when people ask, what is the metaverse? I like to talk about the fact that it's really just the next evolutionary stage of the internet. Similar to that transition from kind of analog to digital, if we can conceptualize it that way, the ability to extend computing power to a new level, it kind of fundamentally changes how we are interacting with each other, with some businesses as consumers, when we talk specifically about the CX space, but with the world in general. And so it's kind of this progress. I spoke, as you mentioned, at the CXO conference in Vegas, and I referenced a gentleman named Mark Weiser, who was at Xerox back as early as the 80s. He was talking about that computing devices would ultimately sort of disappear. And he used the term ubiquitous computing, which is kind of cool. As computers become more world aware and contextually aware. That's how he was talking about it that long ago. And then as recently as I think it was this year's developer conference for Google, Sundar Pichai calls it ambient computing, which made me think about the idea of ambient CX, which you and I have discussed briefly, I think on a previous CX files. So a long way of saying it's if we can conceptualize it as segueing into a new computing era, maybe that's the best way to think about it.
Okay. And yeah, maybe it would be good to talk a little bit about your CX Outsourcers talk, because I only saw still images from that. I wasn't there, unfortunately. I know Peter was there, obviously, as one of the organizers. But I did see that you were referring to Matthew Ball's Metaverse book, and some of these ideas around it being a new virtual space. So what were some of your key points during that talk, and how did the audience react to it?
Yeah, really good question. I think the overarching theme is one that you and I have talked about over the years, the idea of exponential technological change, which is very much the metaverse is a part of that larger dynamic. And I started off the presentation by going after retired General Barry R. McCaffrey, who is a 4-star retired general, and to me, very much sort of a figure out of Dr. Strangelove, because he's one of the guys they go to CNN and MSNBC and you name the outlet to get the latest input on all the violence that's being unleashed across the world by various state actors. And he, in other words, is the great expert. Well, back in May, just before I spoke on the Metaverse in Lisbon at a teleperformance event, there was this amazing incident where McCaffrey actually tweeted out a video of a missile that he claimed was the impressive Ukrainian defense forces shooting down a Russian jet. And he shared this video. Well, he was quickly informed by some people on Twitter that he had actually shared by mistake a video from the game Arma 3. And he quickly deleted his tweet when he realized that he'd mangled his analysis. But of course, it lives on in infamy forever now because some people saved his tweet. But that kind of captured the idea of kind of diving into the topic of how exponential technologies are racing ahead, leaving us very much bewildered in many cases as individuals. And retired General Barry R. McCaffrey was kind of the ultimate example. But in a serious way too for us, it's the same sort of dilemma happening with enterprises that need to try to keep up with what Brynjolfsson and McAfee and Race Against the Machine over a decade ago called the Great Restructuring, that technology was racing ahead, but organizations and individuals were very much left behind. So that was my entry point into the quote that you mentioned by Matthew Ball and others. I was trying to make people understand the huge amounts of money and energy and brain power that's being expended now and put into this realm. There's a lot of investment, a lot happening, not just in the US, but in other parts of the world and in China and such. So it was a fun thing to talk about. And I think it kind of stirred up some good conversations.
Yeah, and I know that you've talked to a few companies now about this. So you mentioned that Teleperformance had invited you to one of their forums as well. Have you seen any type of particular industry above others that is exploring this? I mean, are there any sort of first movers, or does it seem easier for any particular industry to use this kind of virtual environment?
Yeah, well, as you know, probably better than me, because I think you're an accomplished gamer. The first industry, sort of the tip of the spear for innovation in the metaverse, is almost certainly the gaming industry. And I just gave an example where reality has been breached in a sense when General McCaffrey thinks that an Arma 3 video is real. I mean, there's nobody more experienced than him. So gaming is a whole area to go into. And at my presentation, I shared some numbers and figures around, back of the envelope estimates of how much is going into that space right now. And the information, which is a great publication, estimated that by 2025, total gaming related metaverse spending could be around 52 billion. And they made the point that, that's a very, very conservative estimate. And they're trying to be very conservative because we see some huge numbers out there. Just last night, I tweeted something by McKinsey and their estimates of the metaverse, but there's some much bigger numbers out there by the end of the decade. But gaming, it's the idea that it's really the innovation driver, key to the metaverse, because that's where most innovation and metaverse-like experiences are probably going to emerge from. But you also have various social platforms, and of course, enterprise communications already is an area where we're seeing workplace collaboration tools and this type of thing. So it's happening fast. And I actually just tweeted out about an hour ago, I saw a short piece that Mark Zuckerberg had commented on how fast the metaverse is coming. It's even surprising him he used the example of Peloton, that in the exercise realm, people are already in a sense experiencing metaverse-like actions, so to speak. So a lot happening there, and a lot more as it progresses and changes and morphs over time.
Yeah, and I think that especially when executives struggle to understand this, I think that gaming is a good way in, because often they've got kids that are using Minecraft or Roblox or Fortnite. And these games are essentially metaverses that, you are inside an alternative universe. You're engaging with other people. I mean, Fortnite is it's incredible fun. I mean, I'm so bad at that game. Every time I go in there, someone just shoots me in a couple of minutes. But just, you know, I mean, I'm old enough to remember going back to when games like Doom were released, and it was a revelation that you could connect your computer using a cable to your friend's computer and then play against each other inside the same game environment. So, you know, the guy in the game that you're shooting with a shotgun is your friend, but now kids think of this as completely normal. You go into a battle royale situation, and there's 100 people in there trying to kill each other, but they're all talking to each other and communicating at the same time, and you've got people from all over the world in all different time zones that are immediately engaging. So with gaming, I think you're entirely right, and actually to your point as well. Microsoft Flight Simulator has become so realistic that I keep on seeing video from it being shared on aviation channels on YouTube, with people saying like, "Hey, look at this crazy maneuver," and then people correcting in the comments saying, "You realize that's a flight simulator, don't you?" You know, so you know, it's getting quite incredible that people don't know the reality from gaming anymore, but. I think that I think that one area that you were mentioning about corporate culture and corporate communications, and the fact that we now have this kind of hybrid work environment. I mean, do you think that could be like an early place where we see this taking off then? Because companies that have a distributed workforce obviously need some way to bring people together.
I do, and in fact. During the Lisbon event that Teleperformance put on, they gave us a chance to walk through their Metaverse sort of lab, and they brought us into the type of experiences that you're suggesting. And the first thing that hit me when I participated in that was, this is really cool. There were definitely awkward difficulties and challenges to get past with everything from the feel of the device to trying to negotiate that space if you're not experienced in it. But the second thought I had was, imagine how much better this is going to get exponentially, and how much easier it's going to become to use. And, you know, you just mentioned Microsoft, and I need to mention that flight simulator experience to my brother, because my oldest brother flew jets for the U.S. Marine Corps, and he was in the first Gulf War a long time ago. But I've actually sat in the actual simulator for it's called the Prowler jet. I think it was a Prowler simulator, but it was an incredible experience. I mean, I crashed, you know, off the aircraft carrier almost immediately, so my mission was not accomplished. But those types of experiences, think about. As you intimate, you start to think of workplace applications and opportunities to bring together ideas and individuals that are really going to propel for perhaps hybrid work and the workplace forward into a new age.
And to create a lot of these experiences requires the high-end PC equipment and the headsets for virtual reality. So, I mean, is that going to be a barrier to entry? Because not everybody's got a VR headset at home yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a set of challenges to the maturation of the realization of the metaverse that we'll probably circle back on, and that's one of them. And I think that's one of them that I mentioned at CXO in Vegas. But on the other hand, I was thinking about this example in this context. You know, there's a company called Spatial. They're based in New York, and they do VR platforms for artists. But they introduced a new kind of a full body avatar option in its app back in, I think it was in May, about halfway through this year. So users can bring in these avatars onto their platform. It's kind of a step forward, as I understand it, for the industry. But there's a couple of interesting points to be made here. The first one is the point about VR headsets. I mean, they expected most users to be using a VR headset to access the app, when in fact, most were going to the web. And so it's kind of an example of how quickly and unpredictable this space or this concept or this computing era is and will continue to be even more so. I mean, I use the example of Conway's Game of Life, the British mathematician from 1970. He came up with this experiment on a computer where he created a very simple game, but found that the automaton that he created, there were a couple of things that happened. From basics, from simplicity came vast complexity, number one. And number two, everything was utterly unpredictable. And so he started to think that he could apply this game of life to things, everything from plants to the study of insects or clouds or galaxies or even maybe the metaverse. So this stuff is unpredictable, and companies, the applications are becoming ever more unpredictable. And that's where innovation takes place, which brings us back to your reference of Matthew Ball's quotation. It's really exciting. But it's important to note, you bring up a very good point. There are some not insignificant hurdles to the realization of this vision. But I just think that that's probably outweighed from where I'm sitting now, based on some of the exciting things that are going on and the amount of brain power and money going into it.
Yeah, and I mean, I was thinking about this because I think that you're right. And clearly we could see a lot more adoption just on the web, but also a lot more adoption of augmented reality than we expected, rather than full virtual reality. But I was thinking that maybe there's an opportunity here as well for different brands, retailers, department stores. I mean, people who have physical spaces that can get the equipment in and create a hybrid experience within their environment. I mean, just imagine, I don't know, a training shoe, like a running shoe retailer. I don't know, what's a big one in the US? Foot Locker, someone like that, if you could go in and actually kind of try out some shoes, go into a metaverse environment. Imagine you're at the Olympics with your new shoes on, or this kind of thing. Just create a whole kind of immersive environment, but actually in store. So the brands are providing all the equipment. Maybe that's another step.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I was even thinking too about, like, when I was a kid. My mom used to love to go to the mall to meet her sisters. This was the big thing: drive to the mall, meet your sisters, and then inevitably they'd have lunch. They might buy a pair of shoes or get their hair done or whatever. But think in the metaverse, I was thinking, gosh, and you mentioned a few minutes ago, in the context of gaming, all the young people and how they experience things these days, which is a little different from our age group, but even our parents' age group, perhaps, and older people going forward. And as the metaverse develops, you could have, someone like our parents just sit down and go to the metaverse to meet their sisters at the mall in the metaverse. And, they can chat and do whatever. I mean, we're already doing virtual happy hours, but at the same time, they might discover a cool pair of shoes that they can order online and this type of thing. So it starts to create a whole set of possibilities imaginatively, the more you talk about it and the more you think about it. And I think that's certainly the case on a much larger level for people like Zuckerberg and others like Matthew Ball that are thinking all the time about applications of the metaverse. And as you say, it's not just, I think it was the head of Unity Software that said, there are different visions for the metaverse. I mean, he said something to the effect of, hey, maybe people aren't going to want to go into this metaverse, this walled off place. We want more interaction with the real world. And that's kind of his vision, as well as the vision of many others. And I kind of think of it as the quote in Gladiator, where Russell Crowe says, and you can check the movie, he actually says this in the original, what we do in real life echoes in the metaverse, and what we do in the metaverse echoes in real life. So you have this kind of crossover between physical and virtual reality. And I think that that's going to take place ever more frequently and frantically, maybe in the future.
Yeah. And that comes full circle from when we were kids and you'd go to the shopping mall, and your mum and dad would go off and look at the shops and leave you to go and play with a fistful of quarters, going to play on the Atari machines. It could come full circle and be a sort of an entertainment pastime, albeit that is essentially only a next step beyond becoming more ubiquitous.
Yeah. And the other thing, when you bring up those examples, and you were probably in the 80s, you were a gamer of some note, relative to somebody like me. I wasn't a big gamer back then, but like the gentleman I referenced from Xerox, Mark Weiser, was talking about ubiquitous computing back in the 80s. And one thing that our age group perhaps has as an advantage to bring to this discussion and making the metaverse real is a perspective. I mean, you have real perspective. You were a gamer in the 80s. You've seen the entire progression. And so imagine all the people, the smart people like yourself that are out there investing in this. And then you bring to all the young people that live completely different lives with a whole other set of ideas. And just the sheer brain power and money globally that are going into this thing. I think there's really something here.
Yeah, I think that we've seen that. I mean, over our lifetime, we've seen that change just because of the internet. The use of the net itself. I mean, even Usenet in the early days, then the web, then social media. Because, like when I was a kid, the other kids that you knew personally were the kids at your school and maybe a neighboring school. Maybe if you were involved in a sports club or something, you might know kids from a few miles further afield. But pretty much it was local. Like that was your span of friendship. And now when I look at my nephews, like teenage nephews, they're just like every day they're talking to kids all over the world. It's completely normal to be logging in and hanging out together inside a game with people everywhere.
Incredible. Yeah, I mean, and this is what, I mean, I've used the expression time is accelerating. I stole that from Yuval Noah Harari at Hebrew University, the Sapiens author. And he's right. And I think what you're saying encapsulates what is trying to be communicated there. In other words, the fact that when you and I were, say, back in the 80s or even the 90s, it was a different world. The opportunity to meet and collaborate with other people was not what it is today. This is what Peter Diamandis was talking about, the X Prize Foundation chairman, when he said, people don't understand that by 2020, I think the number was something like 5 billion people would now be, by a couple of years ago, be online. And what he said, what that meant would be that we would live in the most innovative era in history, which is right now, because of what you just described. I mean, you can get on and discuss and collaborate and think with people that you never could have accessed before from all over the world. It's really stunning. It's amazing.
Yeah. I think that before we finish, I'd just like to bring up a couple of points from different comments online. Because yesterday I tweeted out, we were going to have this conversation, and I just wanted to see what people would say. So there was a comment on Twitter from Alexander Villares, who's actually here in Sao Paulo as well. And he's a tech educator. And he was saying basically that, he thinks the metaverse is just BS, and how many people in a country like Brazil, with over 200 million people, are going to be using a VR headset in the next 5 years, and how does it actually improve their life? And just to illustrate that, I mean, I just went out quickly and looked at the price of some of the headsets. You've got the Quest, about $550 here, the Rift, over $1,100. But your minimum salary in Brazil at the moment is about $220 a month. I mean, if you're waiting tables or something like that, then you're getting that much or not much more. So, if you're looking at 4 or 5 months salary for one of these VR headsets, then I mean, it seems that there's going to be a different path to it becoming normalized here, don't you think?
Yeah, and it's an excellent question and I'd bring it back to the earlier point I made with the example of spatial. They didn't expect people to be accessing their app via the web, but indeed that's what happened. And so these are expensive headsets, for example, that you've given here, and Meta platforms and Oculus. But who's to say that people are going to be wearing necessarily headsets to access some of these experiences? Would be my first answer. And then the second reply, without denying the veracity and the seriousness of his question, which is a very good one, is that innovation is propelling us forward at such a rate that, let me give an example that I used at CXO Outsourcers in Vegas. We've long talked about Moore's Law and the idea of the strip of transistors you can fit on a strip of silicon that are doubling it roughly every year and a half. And that's been the case since he observed it in 1965. The critics have said, well, what happens when you can no longer slice something so small that you run up against barriers for Moore's Law? Well, wouldn't you know it, now they're working on things in the realm of optics. In other words, using photon-enabled rather than electron-enabled transistors that are, early word out is that these new types of transistors are something like 1,000 times more powerful and effective than your traditional or your standard electron-based transistor, and that they have all sorts of ambient capabilities, back to that term ambient computing and ambient CX. Now, this stuff is still evolving, so it's no magic answer yet, but this idea of exponential change, that we assume by 2030, people are going to have a big, heavy headset on, they're covering their face. Maybe that won't be the case. Maybe it'll look a little different. The other quick point I would make, I think that people also make the mistake of associating the metaverse sometimes too much with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta platforms. I mean, he's smart enough to name his company after a much larger phenomenon that's going to include loads of other firms that indeed are going to have to collaborate and work together. And so they're just scratching the surface. There's so many other types of firms out there that are working on this stuff. And that's part of the point too of Matthew Ball's quotation there, which also is a good answer to Alexander. And I can, if you don't mind, I'll read his quote. And if you think about what he's saying, it's a great way to sort of think about it. He said that the brilliant thing about platform changes of this magnitude is its unpredictability. We can say blanket statements like participate in an AR world, spend more time wearing VR headsets, and own more virtual goods. But innovation is recursive. Some brilliant technology is created which inspires more innovation, leading to new behaviors, unlocking new use cases. Suddenly, I like this, I think it's great, something no one thought we needed, like a persistent real-time rendered simulacra of the world, will feel essential. No amount of internet speculation in the 1990s would have led you to TikTok remixes on the Billboard 100, Wall Street bets and YOLO options, or Bored Apes Yacht Club. And I think you and I, Mark, can testify to that. I mean, we loved the 90s. Those were our salad days, maybe. And, I wasn't thinking about those things back then. And so time is accelerating. Things change quickly. And I think that's probably the best answer to the skeptics.
Yeah. And it's funny because earlier today, I was just reading about a band. A friend of mine is in a band called Ladytron, and they're an electronic British band. It's like a sort of updated British Kraftwerk. And
Nice.
One of their most famous albums came out 20 years ago, and they just did a big kind of, repackaged version of the album. But some of the songs have taken off on TikTok as remixes, and there's like another whole generation discovering their music from a social media platform, not from people even going to Spotify or Apple Music to listen to the stuff,
Well, it's incredible. I need to listen to that. And yesterday, you and I had an exchange as well about the metaverse and the skeptics. And speaking of music, I used the example of the great British band Genesis, which, as we both know, is the greatest band of all time. And you and I were fortunate enough to see Mike and the Mechanics a few years ago in England, in Reading, featuring Mike Rutherford, their bassist for Genesis. But there's a song that I think of when the skeptics come at me on this, from 1976, A Trick of the Tail album, the song of the same title. And it's such a great little ditty. I think Tony Banks probably wrote it, but it's about this creature that sets off from this city, and he wants to make people understand, normal human beings, that there's this golden city on the horizon, and this wonderful place really exists. And they throw him in a cage, and they don't believe him, and they make fun of him, and eventually he escapes and goes back to the city of gold. But there will always be skeptics out there. But if they can just join us in this journey and listen to a little bit of Genesis, read a little bit of James Joyce, I think they're going to see that it's a pretty exciting future before us.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to ask you about a blog that I saw from Paul O'Hara, a good friend of ours from Teleperformance. He actually, it was only a few days ago, he published a blog saying that you need to have a chief metaverse officer inside your company. But one thing I saw that he did say towards the end of the blog, when he was summing it up, he said, if you don't have a chief metaverse officer, then at the very least, you need to be looking at all of your suppliers and asking if they've already got one. So somewhere in your supply chain, someone needs to be thinking about it. I mean, is that something that you'd agree with?
Oh, 100%. And for a couple of really important reasons. I mean, you need to try to understand how, it's one thing to be a brand in today's world, in today's reality, but you need to have people that are leading the strategy sessions of how is your brand going to be perceived perhaps in the metaverse itself? Is it going to be significantly different? What will it take to tailor that brand, or perhaps create a sub-brand, if you will, within the universe that makes that crossover from the gladiator quote real? The second great reason for a chief metaverse officer, it just occurs to me, might be this point about the skeptics again, because there are real things that we're going to confront. The first thing that comes to mind, for example, security and privacy. Microsoft had a warning earlier this year about that the metaverse could fall apart if you're not paying attention to cybersecurity issues around this type of stuff. And that's an example of the questions and the concerns you need to be thinking about. Another example would be what happens if globalization writ large, whatever that means to you, is somehow ended or changed forever. And I've written about this early in the pandemic. It's very conceptual, but if Russia or China are cut off in a sense from the West in ways we hadn't anticipated, how might that influence the metaverse writ large and some of the innovations that might have taken place otherwise? And then the whole question of young people. There were a couple of studies recently by Goldman and Piper Sandler that, to Alexander's point, perhaps in Brazil, I think Piper Sandler found that 26% of young people own VR devices, but only 5% are using them today in the current environment. And so you need chief metaverse officers to be thinking about the challenging questions that are already out there, and there are going to be even more of them that arise as the future sort of hurdles at us at high speed.
Yeah, and you mentioned there about the familiarity of brands and how that might transfer into a virtual environment. And I think that plays into something that William Carson from Ascensos posted on LinkedIn when he was asking about this. And I saw that you commenting and talking to him on LinkedIn about how when you were on a long drive in Pakistan before and seeing a Dunkin' Donuts and the relief that you got from knowing that there would be like a Dunkin' coffee, are we going to try and see this kind of familiarity transferred into a virtual environment as well?
Wow, that's a great point. William, he put together a great little piece on LinkedIn about how, I think he referenced Starbucks and how comforting it was to run into Starbucks out in the desert outside of Las Vegas. And I responded with, well, I was, shocked when we were driving late at night from Islamabad to Lahore or vice versa, I forget which. And we pulled over at a Dunkin' Donuts. It looked exactly like one you'd see in Boston. And indeed, my medium coffee with skim milk and no sugar tasted the same. So it was comforting. So if you think about as far as brands go, when you're in the metaverse, the different applications and all sorts of transactions that might take place that can offer people, individuals, that type of delight, to use that phrase, then yeah, I mean, the potential is it's really interesting to think about. And the most interesting thing too is to think about the stuff that will be happening, say, after 2030 that we're not even thinking about yet. I was listening to Lex Friedman. He had Ray Kurzweil on from Google a few days ago, and Kurzweil's sticking by the idea that AI is going to pass the Turing test by the end of this decade, which kind of blows your mind when you think about it. Is he right or not? Who knows? But he seems to be right about a lot of things. So yeah, brands need to be aware of what's happening, and they better be thinking about this in a number of ways.
Yeah. Okay. Well, nobody remembers Tom from MySpace anymore. So clearly we need some sort of leadership on where all of this is going to go in future.
Yeah, that's right. And on top of all that, it's a lot of fun to try to imagine the possible worlds and the gold city that we'll all be whistling to sooner rather than later.
Right, Steve, that's great. That's a great summary. I mean, I think that there's so many more things we could go into, like you just mentioned transactions and property ownership. There's trust and safety. So, there's a whole load of other areas, but I think we'll have to dip into them at a later date, because that's a long enough summary already. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I really appreciate it. Can I end with one quick quote from the science fiction writer, William Gibson? Because I ended my CXO presentation with this. He said when somebody asked him in this great New Yorker article a couple of years ago, how do you get your ideas for your work? And he looked at the guy and he said, all I have to do, and here's the quote, was look outside his window. The world outside the window was beginning to look considerably stranger to me than the ones I was imagining for my fictional futures. And so it's, that's really capturing too how quickly things are changing in reality, often in surreal ways. And so we can go off with William Gibson there.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.